Drums of War, Chapter 21, Insertion. Aboard the Lawrence. The bone implants itched. More irritating to Private Peter George was how often they caught in things as he walked. Elbows, knuckles, knees all required just a little extra situational awareness, and he only had been getting used to them for a few days, and he was already being inserted. Thankfully, the skin and iris dyes had stopped itching an hour after the final surgery. But the bony implants itched at the points of fusion, which were of course beneath the protruding bone spikes. So the bone implants itched, and Peter couldn't do anything about it. He could regulate. The point of the dyes in the implants was to make it possible for him to infiltrate populated areas to gather intel and eliminate targets of opportunity. A heady duty, the last one. Under normal circumstances, the rules of engagement for assassinations would be strictly defined to military command structure, but he was being deployed under total war protocols. Whether a target was valid or not rested entirely on his shoulders. His family name was lighter than the responsibility. Still, though, he had taken it up. The training for advanced drop recon wasn't much more difficult than the ASDSS training, as ADR was folded into the MOS. But it was necessary to take a crash course in the language and culture of the Exarch, which was disturbing. The whole sort of thing was about avoiding a painful death on the altar to a bloodthirsty idol at the bottom, and deciding who gets knifed at the top. The serfs and the administrators held up the aristocracy and the royal family of sorts, and even the aristocrats weren't completely safe from the altar, though from what data they had, it was extremely rare. Private Peter George tried not to think too deeply about it, not in the moment anyway. He was busy penning letters, ink and paper, old school, writing an "if you're reading this any other way" was just wrong. He was on the last one, the most difficult, to his father. He spun the pen on his palm and exhaled. Then he did it again. Then once again. Then he put pen to paper and looked at the paper, willing the words to come. Then he began with what he felt. Dear Pops, I'm sorry about joining ADS instead of the Lost Boys, but if you're reading this, you know what happened. I know you don't believe anyone else can command a George properly. I don't know if you're right, but I do know how to do my duty. Your outfit holds up Grandpa's legacy in a way that I don't think anyone outside of it or the family really understands. But there is another part of the report's legacy. To do what is needed, without regard to the cost to yourself. I've seen you do this my entire life, so you cannot be angry with me for following this example. The work the ADR does is imperative to the war, and you know it. Aragon got us a lot of intel, but you know better than most that the data of one ship isn't enough to win a war. You know the training I've gone through to become an ASDSS. You know the risks of that MOS. So do I. That's why, before I climb into the stealth drop pod, I penned this letter. Remember that I served the Republic and her civilians. Out of duty, yes. Duty you instilled. But love also. Love for my country, for her people, and most of all, for my family. The longer this war goes on, the greater chance that one of us pays the bill. My skills, my talents, are best used to bring the war to a close as quickly as possible. So please forgive me for not joining the Lost Boys. Peter. He folded the letter, pressed the Republican Naval Infantry seal over the edges, put it in a stack with all the others. He could leave them on the desk. A Navy rating would be by to look for the "if you're reading this" letters after he launched. But it seemed to him like doing it that way was a form of denial. He was walking into this with open eyes. He knew well the risk he was taking. So he gathered up the stack and marched his way to the mailroom. "I have letters with conditional sending," he said to the petty officer on duty. She winced and asked, "Under what conditions are these to be sent, Private?" "Should I be missing or killed in action?" "Aye, Private, it shall be so." Private Peter George turned on his heels and went to the chow hall for the last Terran meal. The Exarch didn't eat anything toxic to humans, so far as the nerds could tell from the captured data, so he wasn't worried about starving to death. He did have serious doubts about the availability of good gumbo planetside, so he was going to savor it before he had to clamber into a coffin and speed towards what was allegedly a forge world, a major manufacturing sector of the Exarch Dominion, and a very likely target for cracking It still needed a look-see to make sure. No sense wasting ammunition on targets not worth the expense, after all. The Voidsmen in the chow hall were a cheerful bunch, by comparison to the RNI ASDSS ADR troopers, who were a morose bunch. A scout platoon is rarely cheerful before a drop. Not surprising, when one recalls that they'd have all just written there if you're reading the letters. The tradition was so ingrained that the Navy required trainee privates to write them for training drops, just to make sure the trooper knew how. The first one required the mailroom ritual as well, but subsequent drops merely required the writing. Of course, one could sham the letters during training, but Private Peter George never did. He hadn't met a scout who even claimed to sham the tradition. Some of those training, if you're reading the letters, had been delivered after all. So by comparison, the quietly chatting enlisted men were cheerful by comparison. But Private Peter George wasn't terribly interested in chatting over the state of the ship with the Voidsmen or the Navy non-coms. He sat amongst his fellow dirt-pounders and ate his gumbo, with the pall of the very real risk that they were taking hanging over the lot of them. "You were in the quarters a long time, Private," First Lieutenant Winter stated. "Aye, sir. Had a lot of letters to write. Your father, and brothers, and cousin, and my aunts and uncles. But I get you, sir. I made sure to write the Major. Maybe he can have you in his outfit after they surrender," the corporal that Private Peter George didn't know well offered. "I expect to catch an earful when I see him next," Private Peter George said sheepishly. "Just like when my brother took the Voidsman route." "Commander Roger George," a sergeant mused. "He's the second star now, right?" "Aye, Sergeant," Private Peter George said. "A bucking for captain in the outfit, but commander's threatening to make him a rear admiral instead." "I heard," the sergeant said conspiratorially, "that the captain of his first ship gave your brother an ultimatum, promotion into the O grades or a court-martial." Peter couldn't help himself. He laughed. "Well, it wasn't a real ultimatum, but from Roger's account, there was a lot of shouting and swearing, and quite possibly an offer to settle the matter in a boxing match, or a duel, depending on how much whiskey he had." For one glorious moment, the clouds over the table parted, and the sunshine that his laughter broke over the table. "Promotion resistance runs in the family," Lieutenant Winters said. "I hope I won't have to fight to put chevrons on your shoulders. Sir, I'm RNI." Once again, the table laughed. But Lieutenant Winters said, "That's an attitude that guarantees command will push you into O-scale, Private. Watch yourself, or you'll be a butter bar in your next drop." The table positively roared. For in that moment, they forgot that they were going to drop in a scant hour. One blessed moment of joy before they got to work. Bloody work. An hour later, Private First Class Peter George entered into his scout pattern armor, checked his loadout, stowed it, and clambered into his stealth drop pod, strapped himself in, and waited. He began to shake the instant his pod's hatch was sealed. The awful wait had begun. The fact that not a single scout had been lost during the drop did little for the shaking, and neither did the scout's nickname for the pods, coffins. Even so, he trembled as he felt his pod lurch closer to the launching chamber. Then his pod slammed into the chamber, and he was slammed against his restraints as he was shot like a missile towards the planet. His trembling stopped. He was away, and to his mind, the worst possibility, being trapped inside a pod as the ship sank, was already avoided. Still though, his stomach churned at the work, bloody work ahead of him. In a surf-breaking facility, the Forge World ex-Nuva, Surf Instructor 1232-03412, formerly Laborer 1232-41453, inspected the work of his charges. He praised the Empress that he did not have to report any of the newly made serfs for shirking or incompatibility. Initiate Highborn, Adad and Lil had made an example of one of their pups, as the serfs called them, but its father had refused to obey. Then the father followed the pup, for he had attempted to prevent the lesson. Surf Instructor 1232-03412 had found the example distasteful, as these had proven the worth of their race, and had earned the chance to show their worth. He had thought that a simple whipping would have been enough, but he was no initiate highborn, and knew better than to question their ways. It was a sure way to lower one's worth. Surf Instructor 1232-03412 had heard troubling things from the new serfs, whispers of rescue from the mysterious Republic. He did not understand the whispers, and suspected that this Republic was some kind of god or goddess. He would have to speak with some of the new serfs during the allotted socialization time about the nanas, for only through great worth could a serf hope to escape sacrifice. However, no warriors from the extraction fleets would speak of this unworthy deity. This was troubling, for Xur, may the stars tremble, had consumed all other gods who had dared stand against him. Surf Instructor 1232-03412 walked down the floor of the surf-breaking facility once again, and once again praised the Empress that she had foresaw worthy serfs in the new territories. He had seen surf instructors drink fermented grain to the point of unconsciousness over how many of their charges wound up in the altar. They did appear to be suffering under the climate, however. Another thing for him to ask about at the allotted socialization time. It had been difficult to speak with any of them, as they seemed to regard him with hostility. But he thought that they did not know that he also was a serf and subject to the altar. Only an hour of work left, and all of the new serfs were still diligently working. He hoped that his report would garner them some extra rations by way of reward. They still had not the worth to gain luxury tokens, but then again, he did not know what kind of luxuries their biology would permit. That was another's task. An hour passed, and once again there was no problems to report, except for signs of fatigue in the few of the new serfs. They did not drop in their productivity, and those around them helped, which was worthy. So Surf Instructor 1232-03412 had very high hopes indeed for his charges. If he could teach them well and help them avoid the wrath of the initiate highborns, he might gain enough worth to be permitted to die of old age and join the Nala. Not that he dared hope that high, well, not seriously anyway. When the bell sounded, Surf Instructor 1232-03412 walked up to the diminutive Mebel, who seemed to be the leader, and said, "Trainee 2412-0034, I have luxury tokens unspent. Shall you accompany me to the intoxicant dealer? Can you imbibe fermented grain or fermented fruits?" "No, I cannot. Not as anything other than vomit-inducing agent, anyway," the serf replied sullenly. "And my name is Pip." "It is unwise to cling to false names. The initiate highborns have little patience with it." "Just try to take it from me," Trainee 2412-0034 growled. "Such is not my place. I merely warn that the wrath above us is terrible. If I presumed to take up a false name, it would earn me 10 lashes across my back to be certain. They have shown less patience with your people." Trainee 2412-0034 narrowed his eyes and slapped the floor with his tail and said, "What do you mean you would get lashes? I am also a serf." "I also am a serf, though I have proven my worth with long labors, such that my betters afford me certain privileges, and I escape the altar. So long as I show my worth, so it is. So long as you show your worth, so it shall be for you." Surf Instructor 1232-03412 couldn't be sure, as the new serf's face was so incredibly alien, but he thought that a look of pity had crossed his face before he said, "Caffeine is an intoxicant for our people. We brew teas. If this intoxicant dealer has tea with caffeine, I'll drink it with you, Sir Instructor." "Praise the Empress, for I wish to tell you how one shows great worth." Aboard the Robin Williams, Major Eric George read the lines over and over. "Pops, I'm deploying soon. The notes gave me a makeover so I could blend in. I'll do our name proud. Pete." Nothing about his deployment, of course, as per the regs. There was some regs and George would challenge, but never once an OPSEC. The short message was even in Republican battle cant written, something that some privates goof. Not his sons, though one of those had become a voidsman instead, but the principle applied. He didn't need clues about where he was being deployed, though. His rank afforded him some privileges in terms of knowing the state of the war. The only place the advanced drop recon would be deployed, who were unattached to a company of drop troopers unlike the other ASDSS, would be deep behind enemy lines. Not any of the conquered planets, but one of the enemy's home turf. His boy was going to give more of himself to the Republic than she ought to dare ask of her sons, though it is necessary. Of course he was proud, more proud than he admitted to himself, of that courage his youngest displayed in volunteering for the assignment. He did hope that the makeover, what a ghastly euphemism for surgical body modifications, was reversible, though. He doubted that his son would be handsome to the ladies with the alterations. He sighed and put aside his personal worries and looked up his professional ones. No KII, no MIA from Operation Hold the Line, but still there were light casualties. Light, as in they came back less an arm or a leg, or maybe their eyes. The enemy had learned how to concentrate fire on a few of the planets they were contesting, which was dreadfully impolite of them. Didn't they know that the enemy only exists to be destroyed? Of course not. Major George thought to himself, or else they'd quit being the enemy. Even still, every last one of them had refused a medical or requested cybernetic replacements. He approved all but one, a sergeant whose injuries were too extensive for cybernetic replacements without extensive clone tissue grafting. The man had refused a discharge, so he recommended medical leave, and failing that, as an instructor sergeant at OCS. Apart from the casualties, he looked over the status reports. All in all, the operation was going well. 26 planets had changed from contested to held, and his only dissatisfaction was the common extra observation on the behavior of the enemy. They had decided to enslave the Lettre rather than exterminate them, and from what the survivors had said, he wasn't sure how much of a favor that was. Beatings, electric shocks, whippings, chemical pain agents, and worst of all, the murder of their children, pups as the Lettre called them, to coerce compliance. It seemed that in one episode, a family was obliged to watch the Exarch roast their youngest pup alive before eating her. The offering Lord Whatever had been de-beaconed by the enraged squad who captured him, and they were jerry-rigged up an ingenious contraption involving a missile launcher and a shuttlecraft to do it. They would almost certainly be justified, but he would be obliged to hold a court-martial over the incident. He had reportedly surrendered, and they convened an officers' tribunal under special circumstances, meaning that the sergeants from the other squads in the platoon had sat in as officers. That unpleasantness could wait until the lost boys were out of action, though, unless the same men go executing a prisoner again. A related matter, the Exarch had not been content to abuse the Lettre where they lived, but instead carried off thousands to be enslaved in worlds unknown. Unknown in the sense that it was unknown which worlds they had been taken to, and in what numbers. Yet these would not remain mysteries for long, as the 2nd Star Rapid Response Group had successfully captured, with RNI shipboard trooper help, several of the pitiful things the enemy thought were battleships. Digitan specialists were already slicing apart the encrypted data and cross-referencing it with clues as to where the civilians had been taken. If only the enemy was more efficient about being defeated by his men. They could push in from the clans of Aldra and aid in liberating them, but they had been rudely persistent in their objections to dying or surrendering. And on that front, he had more disturbing reports to read. It seemed that the rank-and-file soldiers of the Exarch thought that the offer to spare anyone who surrendered to be a lie, a means to make killing them all for what they call the vengeful godless republic, to have their fill of blood and souls. It seemed that every last prisoner who didn't call himself acolyte something or priest whatever was completely nonplussed at not being brutally murdered. Couch the offer of surrender to the Republic in religious terms. Tell the Exarch warrior slaves that the Republic does not want to drink their blood. Get the psych warfare nerds to figure something out. On a more positive note, several of the Lettre resistance bands had shown the possibility of qualifying for being recruited to the Lost Boys. Some of them were already power armor and drop trained, veterans of anti-pirate operations attached to the Republican forces. However, if he knew his own commission, he knew that all of the potential recruits were already training. He approved the requests to fold in irregulars. Those who couldn't hack it would wash out and be given the opportunity for alternate service, or transferred to the Star Council forces, which had finally mustered. The kingdom of Jacuvia was being reinforced by them, which they sorely needed. The googly-eyed friends had made the enemy pay for every last inch, though. Blood for time, a dreadful bargain. He calmed Admiral Nelson. How are the reports on your end? Their ship's barely scuffed our paint. I've been riding this desk for hours. Spar? Oh, God, yes, Admiral Nelson said emphatically. Get your gloves and meet me in the gym. Then let's write up our report to command. All right. Maybe I'll go easy on you. You deserve to win for once. Don't you dare, his friend scolded. I'll beat your ass fair and square. Major George laughed and cut the comms. It was a good up, and he needed to work off the worries not alleviated by the reports. End of chapter. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Casper Arnholtz, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.